Hare Krishna. Thank you, all of our viewers out there, for being patient. And we had our previous program went a little longer than expected, and I'm so glad to have my dear friend Krishna Kshetra Maharaj, who I've known for 40 years, I guess, more than that. I think we first met in Rainy Park, I remember.
Yes, that sounds right.
Yeah, we had a great time there. So we are so much pleased. Let me just say a few words before we introduce you and introduce today's topic, to just talk a little bit about this whole program that we're doing with the GBC Strategic Planning Team. We are conducting 35 days. We started it with Advaitacharya's appearance day. We're going to go all the way through to Gaur Purnima, and we're going to have every day at least one, if not two, maybe three different broadcasts, so that we can dive deeply into Sri Chaitanya-charitamrita and try to connect with that and relish it from every angle. So we invite our audience to please stay tuned. Make sure, if you're not already subscribed to any of our lists, to our Facebook page or our YouTube channel, or particularly our mailing list, because our mailing list, we send out every day a broadcast schedule, what's coming up. It's really the best way to keep on top of this this great event. So that's my pitch. Now, for today, in our efforts to really connect deeply with Sri Chaitanya-charitamrita, we've turned to you, Maharaj, to help us get a little idea about the historical impact. But I'd like to first ask you, I mean, you are now aware. This is it's a beautiful looking place.
I'm in the middle of Poland. I'm in a place in the country, right next to a huge forest. And yes, it is a very nice, peaceful place. I've been sort of hiding out here since last June with the pandemic. So yeah, that's where I am. But I'm kept quite busy while I'm here with, as I think all of us are, with online events and so on.
Yeah. I mean, this is something that we're realizing now in doing all of this, is that a new world has opened up in one sense for us in terms of our online outreach and online activity, online relationships, and that we're going to have to really learn to go into this deeply and figure out how to make, like Srila Prabhupada was always keen to use technology to enhance our service to Krishna. We asked you particularly to help us in looking at the history, because you have a academic background. You're a professor, or you've been a professor, have a doctorate from Oxford, and you've studied a lot of these topics from an academic perspective.
Well, that may be an exaggeration. I'm not so much a historian, in fact, but there are historians of our tradition that I've consulted in the last few days just for this event. So I hope I can share some of what they have gathered.
So, because we started a little late, I prepared a bit of a set of some questions to kind of lead us along, and so I thought we should just begin. Before we get into the history of the CC, the Chaitanya-charitamrita itself, perhaps you can give us a little of the context of the time, the period, the historical period in which Chaitanya-charitamrita appears. I thought that would be a great place to start.
Okay. First, though, let's sanctify the atmosphere with some Pranati. Om Ajnana-timirandasya Gyananjana Shalakaya Chakshurun Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namah. Sri Chaitanya-manobishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Gadamahyam Dadati Swapadantikam. Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prishtaya Bhutale Shrimate Bhakti Vedanta Swamin Iti Namine. Namaste Saraswati Devi Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschatya Deshatarine Vanchakalpatrubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namah. Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasadi Gaura Bhakta Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. So I'm first of all want to express my gratitude for this opportunity to share with all of you in preparation for the celebration, or as part of the celebration of the appearance of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. And yes, we want to look at the historical impact of Chaitanya-charitamrita. All we can really do is a bit of sketching of some of the contours of this topic, and to get an idea of the historical situation. We're talking, first of all, about the 16th century, according to the Western calendar, 16th century of what's now called the Common Era. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's wonderful pastimes have been taking place from the later part of the 15th century into the first third of the 16th century. And during that time, he has sent a few of his especially learned followers to Vrindavan to settle and there to establish the theology and the practice of what will come to be recognized as Gaudiya Vaishnavism or Chaitanya Vaishnavism. And so he sends these, they come to be known as generally the 6 Goswamis, although actually there were, you can say 7 or even 8 Goswamis. Srila Rupa Goswami, Sri Sanatan Goswami, Srila Jiva Goswami, Gopal Bhatta Goswami, Srila Raghunath Das Goswami, Srila Raghunath Bhatta Goswami, and also Lokanath Goswami was there, and others. And their mission was, number one, to revive or to excavate, sometimes the word is used, the transcendental realm of Lord Krishna's pastimes, Vraja Vrindavan, and at the same time to establish the practice of Krishna consciousness, especially through their writings. And all of their writings were being done in Sanskrit language. They were writing in Sanskrit. They were writing in Bengali script. If you go to the Vrindavan Research Center, Vrindavan Research Institute, which is near the Krishna Balaram Mandir in Vrindavan, you can see, when they put on display, you can see some of the beautiful handwriting of Srila Rupa Goswami in Bengali script, but they were writing Sanskrit. And one of the questions that one may ask is, why were they writing in Sanskrit? Well, they were writing for the learned. Sanskrit was the lingua franca of the learned of India, and their purpose was to establish the authority of the teachings of Lord Chaitanya, and that required that they write in Sanskrit. There was also a Brahmin community in Mathura, a very ancient community of Brahmins who were worshiping the Lord as Varahadev. There are two temples of Varahadev there, I understand. And so they may have had them sort of immediately in mind, but also Varanasi or Benares, the pundits of Benares, certainly they would have wanted to address them. And so all this, in this context, they were at the same time aware that writing in Sanskrit is not going to, it's not going to reach the wider public, whom they certainly also wanted to reach, and whom Chaitanya Mahaprabhu certainly wanted to reach. The whole spirit of his mission was clearly to spread the practice of Krishna consciousness, the chanting of the holy names everywhere to everyone. And in particular, they were concerned with reaching the people of Bengal, especially considering when Chaitanya Mahaprabhu departed the world in 1533 or 34, some say 33, some say 34. After his departure, then, how to continue his legacy? This was the big question. Now, I have to say, for those of you who may be now watching, who also attended His Grace Hari Parshad Prabhu's very wonderful presentation yesterday, that he explained these points very, very nicely, how Krishnadas Kaviraj was recognized to be so profoundly qualified to take up the task, which the Goswamis saw the need, the Vrindavan Goswamis saw the need to fulfill. And so sometime later, Krishnadas Kaviraj came to Vrindavan. It's estimated probably in the year 1554, between 54 and 57. He was a young man at the time. He remained in Vrindavan for the rest of his life. He lived apparently into his 90s. And he is well respected, aside from his writing of Chaitanya-charitamrita, which was his last work. He's especially celebrated for his Sanskrit work, the Govinda Lilamrita. But he took up with full dedication the writing of Chaitanya-charitamrita. As we know from the work itself, he writes how he is concerned whether he will be able to finish. He describes himself as being quite elderly. He says his hands are shaking. He does not know, will he be able to complete it? But as we all know, and this is what one of the things we're celebrating in all these discussions, is that he very much indeed completed the Chaitanya-charitamrita, a work which has been referred to by one scholar, Tony Stewart, who has researched extensively on the biographical works pertaining to Mahaprabhu. He referred to Chaitanya-charitamrita as the final word. For the Gaudiya Vaishnavas, in many respects, it became the final word, the authoritative word on the theology of who is Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and how does one practice Krishna Bhakti following Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. Now, I think it's also important to be aware that by the 16th century, the Srimad Bhagavatam was very much recognized in Bengal as an important work, as an authoritative work. It was celebrated already in poetry, in performative arts, and so on, especially the 10th canto, and the recognition of the Srimad Bhagavatam is an important background, because one way of understanding or appreciating the Bhagavatam, the Chaitanya-charitamrita, is that it is a commentary on the Bhagavatam, which is of a very special type because it is simultaneously telling the life of the ideal reader of the Bhagavatam, namely Chaitanya Mahaprabhu.
Hmm.
So it's, in this respect, a very powerful work.
I'm going to ask you to describe a little bit more about the environment in the Gaudiya community. We know that Krishnadas Kaviraj leaves Bengal basically on the order of Nityananda to go to Vrindavan, but at that time he's not actually going there to write or to compose, but he's going there because he's ordered to. And then he arrives, and then on the order of Govinda, practically speaking, he begins this work. But tell us a little bit about the environment in the Gaudiya community at this time. You mentioned now that the Chaitanya-charitamrita becomes the final word. Is that means that there was some kind of debates going on, or like we see in Christianity, we see how there was in the early days of after Jesus's departure, there was lots of debate going on about him. Was that also the situation? And I'm going to let you take the full screen while I listen.
Okay. Yes, my understanding is that this is very much the case. How much explicit debate was going on, I couldn't say, but there were different views about, as you mentioned, the identity of Jesus in Christianity. There were different views about the identity of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. It was generally understood. All of his followers had this idea. Vrindavan Das Thakur, who of course wrote, he's identified by Krishnadas Kaviraj as the Vyasa of Chaitanya Lila. Vrindavan Das identifies Chaitanya Mahaprabhu as an avatar of Vishnu, of Krishna. Others have similar ideas. And we have to remember that we're talking about the 16th century. The amount of communication that's going on, the speed of communication that's going on, is nothing like what we have today. And so there were different communities of Gaudiya Vaishnavas congregating in different towns and villages with different leaders, each of whom had their own understanding of who is Chaitanya Mahaprabhu in particular. And we get a hint of that in what is it, chapter 6, Adi Lila of Advaitacharya and his followers. And Krishnadas Kaviraj mentions that Advaitacharya had, was it 6 sons? And 3 of the sons are understanding who is Chaitanya, and 3 of them are not understanding. They don't recognize him. And Krishnadas uses very strong language. He refers to them as asara, as deviated, non-essential, literally. So there were different ideas floating about in Bengal, and at the same time there was a sense that Śrī Caitanya is central, but in what respect and in what relation, especially with regard to Advaitacharya and Nityananda Prabhu. So one of the things...
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, one of the things we see Krishnadas Kaviraj doing in Adi Lila in chapters 8 and 9, he gives us what he calls the Chaitanya tree of Krishna Bhakti, which is a wonderful extended metaphor in which there's an organic interconnection amongst branches and sub-branches, with Chaitanya as the trunk and the 9 sannyasis as the roots, and Madhavendra Puri as the seed, and then the branches, the sub-branches, Sakha, Upasakha, and so on. And what he does with this is he integrates everyone in very particular relationships. And it seems that as a result of this, everyone kind of said, oh, okay, yes, this is how we all relate. Whereas prior to that, they didn't know.
Unifying force.
Yeah, it was unifying, and at the same time, it was acknowledging these different branches and seeing them as fruit bearing, and so on.
Now, you mentioned that this was not the time of internet. There was not the time of printing presses. I mean, it was so. But books were being written. The Goswamis were writing, and now Krishnadas Kaviraj. First of all, he's writing in Bengali, so that's another thing maybe you could tell us about, because you mentioned how the Goswamis were writing in Sanskrit. Was there? But here we have Krishnadas Kaviraj writing in Bengali. And what's the expectation? How are these? Is there sort of an idea that these writings are now going to be disseminated, that this is not just something, what do you call it, a hobby? I'm going to write this down for my own sake, but that I'm writing it for the world and it's going to go out. How did that take place during these times?
Manuscripts were copied. This is standard procedure, and it's a common practice now of scholars when they are examining manuscripts of anything in particular, to note how many different copies of a particular manuscript there are, because that's an indicator of how popular that particular text was. So, for example, the Mahabharata, there are probably thousands of copies, manuscripts of the Mahabharata throughout manuscript collections in and beyond India. They're not all identical. That's another subject. The works of the Goswamis, how many, for example, of Jiva Goswami's Shatsandarbhas, I can only say that, that when Radhika Raman Prabhu was doing his doctoral study at Oxford on the Paramatma Sandarbha, he visited various libraries, appropriate libraries in India to find manuscripts. He was able to locate 6 manuscripts, of which he was able to get copies for his work. There were more than that, but he was only able to access 6 for his own work. So that's a kind of study in itself, to see how many copies of different works have survived and where they have ended up. The sort of how to say, the dynamics of how manuscripts have traveled can be an interesting subject. But certainly the idea was that they would be copied, and copy means by hand, letter by letter, line by line. So it was quite a ordeal for this to happen.
And the first copies, or I assume they were copies, not the originals, are dispatched to Bengal with a whole trove of Goswami literature, and we know that there's the whole story of it being stolen and so on.
Yeah.
Was that like that must have been somewhere in the plan? Okay, where this is being written, now let it go out. Book distribution, right?
Yeah, you would think so. All that we have, we do have this story. There are 2 versions of this quite dramatic story. One from the 17th century, the Prema Vilasa of one Nityananda Dasa, who was a follower of Janavadevi, and therefore a follower of Nityananda Prabhu. The Prema Vilas gives you can say the first account of that story. And then several decades later, in the, I think, early 18th century, we have Narahari Chakravarti Thakur's Bhakti Ratnakar account, in which he does some, dare I say, embellishment on the description of Nityananda Das. And in any case, the story is that it was Jiva Goswami who commissioned Srinivasa Acharya to go to Bengal. He was accompanied by Narottam Das Thakur and Shyamananda Prabhu. And they had 2 wagons, 2 ox carts, apparently, full of manuscripts. And they had 10 guards, armed guards with spears and so on. And they traveled all the way to what is southwestern Bengal, and then in a place near to Vana Vishnupur. Vishnupur is a town in, I think it's the Midnapur district, southwest. They stopped overnight after going through the Jharikand forest and remembering how Chaitanya Mahaprabhu had traveled through that forest. They emerge and they come into southwestern Bengal, and after a night, apparently what was a peaceful night, the next morning they wake up to find that all of the manuscripts are gone, completely gone. And the story is very dramatic in, at least I think it's Prema Vilas version, that it had not been copied, but rather this was the only, this was the very edition of Krishnadas Kaviraj that he had personally written was now lost. And the story goes that Srinivas, feeling totally devastated, wrote a message to Krishnadas Kaviraj in Vrindavan reporting what happened. And then the story goes, and this may be apocryphal story, but that he read this note, he was so devastated. Very soon after this, he gave up his life in this, thinking that all of his work had been for naught, had been lost. Well, as we know, this story has a happy ending in that Srinivas eventually finds the manuscripts. He meets Rajbir Hambir, the local chieftain, some referred to as a king, but something of a robber baron, apparently. And he is portrayed, I believe it's by Narahari Chakravarti Thakur. He is portrayed as, he's compared to Jagai and Madai. So it's a kind of parallel made that, long story short, Srinivasacharya converts Rajbir Hambir. He has a profound change of heart as Srinivas corrects the Pandit who is attempting to describe Krishna Lila in the court of Rajbir Hambir. When Srinivas stands up and begins to correct the Pandit and describe Krishna's pastimes, Krishna Lila, the Rasa Lila, with the proper understanding. So we are told Rajbir Hambir becomes overwhelmed. He has a change of heart, and Srinivasacharya becomes his guru. And then as soon as the manuscripts are recovered, he understands the need that they be copied. And so we are told that under the sponsorship of Rajbir Hambir, that Chaitanya-charitamrita was copied, that copyists were engaged, and several copies of Chaitanya-charitamrita were made on the spot, apparently in Vishnupur. And then these copies, this was a substantial number. No number is given, but a substantial number so that it would indeed survive and be distributed to the important leaders of the Gaudiya Vaishnava communities in Bengal.
So do we have an idea that this is, so this is arriving in Bengal? We know that there's the grand Ketari Gaur Purnima festival takes place sometime after this, and do they sort of appear there and everyone receives them, or do we know anything about what happens after that?
I won't say much about the Ketari Gram festival because Mother Sitala is going to give a whole talk on that subject, I think, in a couple of days. But I will say it was an event of consolidation organized by Narottam Das Thakur, of course. He was originally from Ketari Gram, and he organized this festival. It was mainly him who did the organizing, sending messages all over Bengal and bringing them all together. And certainly this and further festivals like it would have been times when the message or the teachings of the Goswamis of Vrindavan would have been preached, they would have been lectured, they would have been discussed, and particularly through the Chaitanya-charitamrita, because the Chaitanya-charitamrita was summarizing the teachings. It was also quoting the teachings. There are several verses quoting straight from Srila Rupa Goswami's writings. But with the Sanskrit, of which there are some 1,500 verses within the Chaitanya-charitamrita, and then the Bengali translation and, in effect, commentary on those verses, all of that would have been discussed in these festivals. Now, it's been explained by one very respected contemporary scholar, Professor Amiya Sen. I think this is a nice point to be aware of. He says that prior to British times in India, there were basically three issues among or in relation to Gaudiya Vaishnavas and Gaudiya Vaishnavism. The first issue that he says was essentially resolved by the Vrindavan Goswamis was to establish bhakti as an independent rasa in the tradition of rasa theory, aesthetics theory, Sanskrit aesthetics. There were debates that were going on for centuries and millennia over what are the principal rasas and so on. And the idea of a separate or independent bhakti rasa is established by the Goswamis, especially, of course, Srila Rupa Goswami. Then the second issue, and this is the one which is of big concern in Bengal in particular, is the relation between Krishna Paramyavada and Gaura Paramyavada. The Vada, the doctrine of supremacy, Paramya, of Krishna on the one side, and of Gauranga, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, on the other side. What is the relation of these two? Professor Sen argues that this was established essentially by Krishnadas Kaviraj. There was a third issue which is taken up in the next generations, especially by Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur and Baladev Vidyabhushana, is the issue of the integration of the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition with the pan-Indian Vaishnava Sampradayas. And of course, that goes into a slightly different tangent, but this issue was going on in particular in the 18th century, and it goes eventually to the court of Jai Singh II in Jaipur, or in Galta, near Jaipur. Yeah, that's another story. But this issue of Paramyavada, Krishna Paramyavada, and Gora Paramyavada, this is being resolved by Krishnadas Kaviraj in his Chaitanya-charitamrita, and then this is being discussed in the assemblies of the Vaishnavas, such as the Ketarigram, the first Ketarigram festival.
Now, we know, though, or let's fast forward a little bit, but maybe you can fill in the gaps, because and talk about the 19th century and the position of Chaitanya-charitamrita after the 18th, when somehow it becomes a bit obscure, it seems.
Yes, this is an area which is, for myself, also rather fuzzy. We do have information from the 19th century about the beginnings of the printing of Chaitanya-charitamrita. What we can say before this is that along with, or somewhat, we can say parallel to what we may want to call the orthodox understanding of the Goswamis of Vrindavan as established in the Chaitanya-charitamrita. Ironically, and we may say rather disturbingly, the various other groups, the Sahajiyas, the Aulas, the Baulas, and others, Kartavajas, they also took the Chaitanya-charitamrita as their authority for justifying their theologies or philosophies, if you like. And how they would do this was by selective, by extraction from Chaitanya-charitamrita, various verses and passages which suited them for justifying their understandings, or we may want to say their misunderstandings of what is Krishna Bhakti, what is Krishna consciousness. So this was going on in 17th and 18th centuries and into the 19th century. And it's these sorts of groups in particular whom we can say our Srila Kedarnath Bhaktivinoda Thakur is very concerned to address, and then also Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur to address and to counter through their very strong preaching. But the point I want to make here is we should be aware that all of them are grounding their positions on the Chaitanya-charitamrita. But how they're doing it is they are being selective, taking passages extracted out of the Chaitanya-charitamrita, and therefore not seeing the whole picture, of the mood of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, his very strict attitude and behavior as a sannyasi in Puri, especially. They kind of put that all aside and ignore it. So that was going on, and all of these what Bhaktivinoda Thakur would call apasampradayas, they all have their texts. They've been busy doing their own writing. They have their own shastra, so to speak, and it is very much going back, or they're basing it on Chaitanya-charitamrita. Now, before we go into the 19th century,
go ahead. Sorry.
I have a bit of interesting information from the early 18th century concerning there was another controversy, a very strong controversy, whether Parakya Bhava or Svakya Bhava is to be understood as the right or the proper, the higher understanding of Krishna Bhakti, of ultimate Krishna Bhakti. This was a subject of debate from the 17th century, but in the 18th century, 1717, there's a date, they actually held court in Bengal, in the court of Nawab Zafar Khan, who was the Muslim governor at the time. The pundits, the Bengali pundits, held a debate. And in this debate, there was one Krishnadev Bhattacharya, who was a disciple of Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, who, of course, promoted, maybe I shouldn't say of course, but he proclaimed Parakya Bhava, or the relationship of non-marriage of Krishna and the gopis, as the highest relationship. His disciple Krishnadev Bhattacharya, or Krishnadev Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya, came to Jaipur and was convinced by the king, Jai Singh II, that he should promote Svakya Bhava. And why he should do that, well, the king had his purposes. He wanted to establish himself as the dharmic king, and he felt it was necessary. Apparently, there were some of these sahajiya practices going on within his realm, influenced from the Bengalis, who were basing their arguments on the Chaitanya-charitamrita. So he, Krishnadeva Bhattacharya, was sent to Bengal to argue, to debate with the Bengalis who were promoting Parakya Rasa. And in the process, Krishnadeva Bhattacharya lost. And he came back to Jaipur to report to the king. He said, I'm sorry, but they have a stronger argument. And the king was not happy with this. Some years later, he was, Krishnadeva Bhattacharya apparently was sent again to Bengal. Again, they had a debate. Again, he was defeated. So all of this is going on within the context of the authority of the Goswamis of Vrindavan, which had been communicated through Krishnadas Kaviraj's Chaitanya-charitamrita.
Exciting. This is dramatic. And the debates still go on, I assume. You know,
Oh, yes.
still,
well, Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur said there's no debates. They're complementary.
they're complementary, yes.
Yeah.
So tell us more about Bhaktivinoda Thakur, because we and his discovery, the influence of Chaitanya-charitamrita, because we're talking about the historical impact, and that's certainly historical.
Yes. Okay. Do we have time?
We can extend. We started late because of the late
Okay.
conclusion of our earlier program, so we at least have another 10, maybe 15, 20, 10 minutes at least, and then.
Okay.
But we should also ask if people have questions. You can start putting them in our comment stream, and we'll get to those afterwards.
Okay. So to appreciate, I mean, this is a whole discussion in itself. Bhaktivinoda Thakur, you know, there's so much that can be said about Bhaktivinoda Thakur's early preaching. But the context of Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur, of course, we're coming into the time of colonial presence. And we know Bhaktivinoda Thakur himself was in his profession. He was a district magistrate under the British rule and so on. But of course, his heart was with the teachings of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, which he became familiar with when he was around 30 years old, as he was stationed in Dinajpur. Now, of course, we're speaking historically. Some will object and say, you know, Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur is an eternal associate of the Lord. He's identified as a Manjari and so on. Yes, all of that is there. And simultaneously, he lived in this world in a particular historical context, which I think makes it all the more, we can appreciate him all the more. Within that context, early 19th century, there began a kind of self-consciousness amongst what came to be called the Hindus. They were becoming more consciously identifying themselves as Hindus, and they felt the need to rejuvenate, revive, and in some ways reform their practices. And they began also organizing, famously the Brahmo Samaj of the early 19th century was established. There were also village organizations called Hari Sabhas, and there was something called the Sanatan Dharma Sabhas. And then there was also a Gauranga Samaj in the late 19th century, which began to subsume the Hari Sabhas within its a larger network. And this included also Odisha, not only Bengal. So we're talking now about Bhaktivinoda Thakur, who in the year 1868, this is after 1857-58 by 10 years, which is a hugely important historical time. The so-called Sepoy Mutiny had taken place, what's now generally called the First War of Independence in India. The relationship with the British has changed significantly, and there's a stronger impetus to reestablish Indian identity, Bengal identity, and religious identity. And I have a quote from Bhaktivinoda Thakur about the Hari Sabhas. He said, "These Hari Sabhas have not been able to effect much change to reform the hearts of the youth due to their propaganda of mixed beliefs, Mishramata. Instead, they became a laughingstock, Hasyaspada. Pious ascetics were saddened and lost their enthusiasm at this outcome. It was through Mahaprabhu's grace that they were organized under a sabha named Vishva Vaishnava Sabha." And of course, this was the institution of Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur, which was inspired by Srila Jiva Goswami's Vishva Vaishnava Raja Sabha. Now, Bhaktivinoda Thakur mentions that he found it difficult to find a copy of Chaitanya-charitamrita. But it seems that around this time, 1868-69, he was able to acquire a copy. It would have been a printed copy, and my guess is it could have been printed. I had a reference here. It may have been around the 1850s that copy was made. Tony Stewart and Edward Dimmock found 9 different publications of the Chaitanya-charitamrita, 9 different printings by different publishers from, I think they said 1845 until 1870 something. So the Chaitanya-charitamrita was being printed, but I was thinking about it this morning. How many copies would they have printed? My guess is not more than 500 copies. Probably 500 copies would have been a very big print run for them. So in that context, Bhaktivinoda Thakur acquires a copy and eventually writes his Amrita Pravaha Bhashya commentary to Chaitanya-charitamrita, which then his son, Srila Bhakti, who becomes Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur, publishes. Bhakti Siddhanta Thakur established his, what he called Bhagavat Yantra in 1913. So this was just very shortly before Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur's departure. And he included, Bhakti Siddhanta included in his printing the Amrita Pravaha Bhashya along with his own Anubhashya. Let's see, checking notes here.
So this would have been, still, this is all Bengali. I mean, no one has translated into, well, what to speak of English, what about into other Indian languages? Has the CC traveled out of, there's a question, in fact, here from one of our viewers. How far did the CC go? Did it reach the South and upper North India areas? Was it contained in Bengal? Do we know about that?
Well, it's very likely known, but not by me. So I don't want to speculate. I'll speculate to the extent that it would very surely have come to Odisha.
Yes.
And I would also expect that it would have gone to the Northeast. What is it? The Northeastern states.
Assam and
Assam, especially.
Yeah,
because
Tripura.
there were...
Tripura is where Bhakti Siddhanta himself, he went there. We might have carried it.
Yeah, so I would have expected it was...
And of course, Vrindavan.
And Vrindavan, yes. But outside of India, well, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Thakur established a Gaudiya Math in Burma, what is now called Myanmar, right, in Rangoon. And apparently his main emphasis was the Chaitanya-charitamrita. So it's possible that it came to Rangoon. It would be interesting to see also history of Chaitanya-charitamrita in what is now Bangladesh.
Yes.
So that would involve going to, libraries in Dhaka.
Right. Well, so now we brought it all the way up, and we are running out of time. So I think we're going to start winding up. But so far, and we are going to, by the way, explore Srila Prabhupada's historical contribution of Chaitanya-charitamrita in English. Do we know of any English translations that happened before Srila Prabhupada's?
I don't know of any translations. There was some, excuse me, there was one Gaudiya Vaishnava missionary, Baba Premananda Bharati, who came to America in 1902, something like that. And he established a small center in Los Angeles, and it's reported that he would read from Chaitanya-charitamrita. He would tell something from it. So this was a harbinger, if you like. It was the beginning. Of course, also Srila Hridaya Bon Maharaj, Bhakti Hridaya Bon Maharaj, went to London and to Berlin and was preaching in the 1930s for 2 or 3 years. And he would have been speaking on Chaitanya-charitamrita to some extent. There's a scholarly work from, I think, 1925 in English about Chaitanya Mahaprabhu from one, what's his first name? I don't remember, Kennedy. And that's about all that I know of from the top of my head.
And today is Chaitanya-charitamrita. I mean, you mentioned Tony Stewart's work, and it's become, I assume, quite a topic for those studying the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition. They would be very much focused on understanding this.
Oh, yes. His work is there. I should maybe mention he and his main professor, Edward Dimmock, published a full translation of Chaitanya-charitamrita in one volume without any commentaries, simply the verses and footnotes and a very extensive introduction with Harvard University Press. That was about 20 years ago. So that's available. Is there someone scheduled who will be talking about the BBT publishing history? Otherwise, I've managed to do some research on that, which I could give in about three minutes.
We will connect with you about that, because what we want to do a big special show. We want to bring Rama Sridhar and Jayadvaita.
Okay. No, they will all know. They will know all of this much better than I do. So
and tell the story, and that should be a great show. So we're working on that. Hopefully, will take place sometimes in the towards the second week of March. So
maybe I can tell a personal story.
Make sure,
Can I tell a personal experience regarding impact of Chaitanya-charitamrita?
Definitely, definitely.
So in 1973, Srila Prabhupada was translating the Chaitanya-charitamrita, and he was translating chapter 7 of Adi Lila, and he became very excited that this chapter in particular is so powerful that we should publish this as a separate book. And so it became a separate paperback book called Lord Chaitanya in 5 Features.
Yes.
And do you remember when it came out?
I remember it. I don't remember, except that it came out.
Well, when it came out, somehow we got a copy. I was in Germany at the time. Somehow we got at least one copy. Maybe we got a few. And we, as we say, we ate it up. We just became so excited at the descriptions of the Panchatattva plundering the storehouse of love of God and distributing it everywhere without restriction, without consideration of qualification or non-qualification. We got so excited. I mean, we used to just, rush out to grab our bags of books and rush out the door. We have to distribute these books. And that was because of chapter 7, Adi Lila Chaitanya-charitamrita, in this single paperback book, Lord Chaitanya in 5 Features.
Yeah. Great. So we are going to have to wrap up. I think we have, let's see, we have one question here, an interesting question. So I'll just, can you give any example of, because you mentioned this, how the Sahajiyas and others had misunderstood or taken, you said, taken selective teachings and ignoring others. Is that have to do with the Ras Leela and things like that?
Yeah, I don't have specific verses because I haven't spent time with this, but they do sort of pick out the description of Ramananda Roy. When he's in Puri, it's described that he was training, giving dance lessons to the young Devadasis, and that he would personally dress them and so on. And they sort of jump on this, and they take this as indicating that he was one of them. He was a Sahajiya. There's been an article written by the late Joseph O'Connell in the Journal of Vaishnava Studies. That's also maybe 20 years ago. He wrote to refute that argument. He very carefully refutes. He shows how that can be refuted. Beyond that, just the general, the identification of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu as Radha or as Radha and Krishna, they sort of extract from that the idea that, well, actually, everyone is either Radha or Krishna, and therefore we can, have this Sahajiya understanding of the physicality of bhakti.
We can see how Bhaktivinoda Thakur felt so elated to find the full Chaitanya-charitamrita and get the actual message. And as they say, the rest is history. What comes after that and what's going on now and what we're doing today with our celebration of the Chaitanya-charitamrita. So we're going to have to end here. Thank you very, very much, Maharaj.
Thank you so much.
To more.
My
I'm just looking forward to more and more of this. We'll find another slot. I mean, because this series is going on until Gaur Purnima, but the broadcasting services of the SPT are going on now forever, we hope. So we want to make this a real service to the society, to be able to bring people like yourself and topics like this to the wider community. And we do hope that everyone subscribes at gbcspt.com, like this, share it with others, come back tomorrow and the next day and the next day, and keep with us, and we're going to dive deeper and deeper. There's so much to come. We're going to be talking about the specifics of the theology of the Chaitanya-charitamrita. We're going to get into topics like the inner purposes of Mahaprabhu's appearance. And we're going to do some fun things like learning about the recipes of Chaitanya-charitamrita and lots more. So please join us. Thank you again, Maharaj. And thank you
so much. I beg forgiveness for any improprieties in what I've spoken. And I beg for the blessings of all the Vaishnavas.
It's been a great pleasure. Thank you very, very much, Maharaj. Hare Krishna.
Premanande, Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.